You wake up tired, not the kind of tired that comes from doing too much, the kind that's already there before you do anything at all. You open your eyes and the weight is waiting. It's in your chest, your limbs, the space behind your eyes. You slept 7 hours, maybe 8, and it didn't matter, because this exhaustion isn't coming from your body. It's coming from somewhere deeper, somewhere sleep can't reach. And it's not just mornings, it's conversations that leave you hollow, jobs that feel like slow suffocation, relationships where you're performing a version of yourself that costs you something every single time. It's the phone buzzing and your entire nervous system bracing. It's the weekend arriving and feeling no relief. It's looking at your life from the outside and thinking, this should be enough, this should be fine. Why does everything feel like it's pulling me underwater? Carl Jung would have recognized what you're experiencing immediately. Not as depression, though it might look like that. Not as burnout, though it might feel like that. Jung understood something about human energy that most psychology still hasn't caught up to. He recognized that the psyche has its own economy, its own system of where energy flows, what it fuels, and what drains it dry. And when everything in your life feels exhausting, Jung wouldn't have asked what's wrong with your schedule or your sleep hygiene. He would have asked a much more uncomfortable question. He would have asked how much of the life you're living is actually yours. Today, I'm going to show you what Jung discovered about why certain people reach a point where everything becomes draining, what's actually happening inside the psyche when this exhaustion hits, why this isn't a sign that something is wrong with you, but a signal that something inside you is trying to change. And what Jung found was the only real path back to a life that gives you energy instead of consuming it. Most people, when they hit this kind of bone-deep exhaustion, start looking for external fixes. Better sleep, more exercise, supplements, time off. And those things aren't useless. But if you've tried them and the weight is still there, it's because the drain isn't coming from outside you, it's coming from inside. And no amount of rest will fix an internal hemorrhage. Jung spent years working with patients who described exactly what you're feeling. People who should have been fine. Their lives looked functional, sometimes even successful, but they were running on empty and they couldn't figure out why. And what he discovered in almost every case was that these people weren't being drained by their circumstances. They were being drained by the distance between who they actually were and who they were pretending to be. Jung understood that maintaining a false self is the most energy-expensive thing a human being can do. He called the social mask the persona. Everyone has one. It's the version of yourself you constructed to be acceptable, to be safe, to be loved, to survive whatever environment you grew up in. The persona isn't inherently bad. It's necessary. You can't walk through the world with no social filter at all. But here's what Jung found was destroying people. For some, the persona had taken over completely. The mask wasn't something they wore during work hours or at family dinners. It had become the only version of themselves they knew how to be. They'd been performing for so long that the performance had consumed the performer. And the real self underneath, the one Jung called the authentic personality, was suffocating beneath layers of accommodation, people-pleasing, and carefully managed acceptability. That suffocation is what you're feeling as exhaustion. Your psyche is spending enormous amounts of energy every single day maintaining a version of you that isn't real. Think about what that actually requires. You have to monitor every interaction for what's expected of you. You have to suppress impulses, opinions, emotions, and needs that don't fit the character you're playing. You have to anticipate what others want and shape yourself to provide it before they even ask. You have to perform enthusiasm you don't feel, agreement you don't share, and patience you've long since run out of. Every one of those performances costs energy, not metaphorical energy, actual psychological resources that your psyche has a limited supply of. And when you're spending 80% of your energy maintaining a persona that doesn't reflect who you actually are, you've got 20% left for everything else. For creativity, for joy, for genuine connection, for the things that would actually feed you. Of course everything feels draining. You're running your entire life on whatever scraps are left after the performance takes its cut. But the persona isn't the only drain Jung identified. There's a deeper one, and this is where it gets uncomfortable. Because the second massive energy sink in most people's psyche is the shadow. Everything you've rejected about yourself, every quality you decided was unacceptable, every emotion you learned to suppress, every part of your authentic nature that didn't fit what your family or culture demanded. All of that material didn't disappear when you rejected it. It sank into the unconscious, and holding it down there costs you energy every single day. Jung described repression as an active process. It's not like putting something in storage and walking away. It's like holding a beach ball underwater. You have to keep applying pressure constantly or it pops back up. Every opinion you swallow, every boundary you don't set, every flash of anger you push down, every moment of grief you refuse to feel, every authentic impulse you override because it might upset someone. Your psyche has to spend energy keeping all of that submerged. And you've been doing this for years, maybe decades, holding down everything that doesn't fit the acceptable version of yourself. Is it any wonder you're exhausted? You're fighting a war against your own nature every waking moment. Your psyche is divided against itself. One part trying to be who you really are, another part spending everything it has to prevent that from happening. This is what Jung meant when he said that neurosis is the suffering of a soul that has not discovered its meaning. When you're living a life that's fundamentally misaligned with who you actually are, your psyche doesn't just quietly accept the arrangement. It protests. It sends signals: anxiety, depression, chronic fatigue, a feeling of emptiness that nothing external can fill, the sense that you're going through the motions of a life that belongs to someone else. These aren't malfunctions, they're messages. Your psyche is trying to tell you that the way you're living is costing more than you can afford to pay. And here's the part most people miss entirely. The exhaustion isn't just about what you're carrying for yourself. Jung discovered that some people, particularly those who grew up in unstable or emotionally demanding environments, are also carrying energy that doesn't belong to them at all. Other people's emotions, other people's expectations, other people's unlived lives. Think about whether this sounds familiar. You're around someone who's anxious, and you leave the interaction feeling anxious. You're with someone who's angry, and suddenly you're carrying a weight that wasn't there before. You spend time with your family and come home feeling like you've been through a battle even though nothing dramatic happened. That's not just emotional sensitivity, that's your nervous system taking on psychic material from other people, because somewhere in your development, you learned that their emotional state was your responsibility. Jung found this pattern constantly in people who described the everything is draining experience. They weren't just maintaining their own persona and suppressing their own shadow. They were also functioning as emotional processors for everyone around them, absorbing anxiety so others could feel calm, carrying tension so the family system could appear functional, managing everyone's emotional temperature at the cost of their own stability. Of course, everything is draining when you're running your own psyche, plus doing maintenance on 3 or 4 other people's unconscious material. And you probably don't even realize you're doing it. It's so automatic, so deeply wired from childhood, that it feels like just being alive feels this heavy. You don't recognize that the weight you're carrying has layers. Some of it is the persona, some of it is the shadow, and some of it was never yours to begin with. But here's where Jung's understanding becomes genuinely transformative, instead of just another explanation for why you're tired. Jung didn't just identify the drains. He found what happens when someone finally stops hemorrhaging energy in all these directions. And what he described wasn't a minor improvement. It was a fundamental reorganization of how the psyche operates. The first thing that has to happen, and this is the part people resist most, is that the persona has to crack. Not be destroyed, not thrown away dramatically, but loosened enough that the authentic self can start breathing underneath it. Jung found that this process usually begins involuntarily. The exhaustion itself is the catalyst. You simply can't maintain the performance anymore. The energy isn't there. And so the mask starts slipping, not because you chose to take it off, but because you no longer have the resources to hold it in place. This is terrifying, because the persona kept you safe. It kept you loved, or at least tolerated. It kept you employed, included, accepted. And when it starts falling apart, your first instinct is to panic and try to reconstruct it, to push harder, perform better, try to get back to the version of yourself that functioned. But Jung was clear about this. The exhaustion isn't a problem to solve. It's a threshold to cross. Your psyche is deliberately withdrawing energy from the false life so that energy becomes available for the real one. This is what Jung called the process of individuation beginning under pressure. When you've spent years building a life that doesn't reflect who you actually are, your psyche will eventually force a reckoning, not through some dramatic spiritual experience, through exhaustion, through the slow, grinding collapse of your ability to keep pretending, through the moment when you simply cannot do it anymore, and everyone around you interprets that as you falling apart, when really, for the first time, something genuine is trying to come together. And if you're feeling that quiet pull right now, that sense that something beneath the exhaustion is asking to be heard, we put together something that might meet you right where you are. It's called True Self-Discovery, 24 practical reflection exercises rooted in Jung's teachings, built to help you find your way back to what's actually real inside you, beneath all the noise and the weight. Click below to start that work today, because the second phase of this process is even harder than the first. Once the persona starts cracking, what's underneath begins to surface. And what's underneath isn't just your authentic self in some pure, beautiful form. What's underneath is everything you buried to build the persona in the first place. The shadow material, the rage you weren't allowed to feel, the grief you never processed, the needs you learned to pretend you didn't have, the parts of yourself that someone, somewhere, taught you were too much, too angry, too needy, too honest, too strange. Jung found that this surfacing often gets misdiagnosed as getting worse. The person was managing before. Exhausted, yes. Depleted, certainly. But managing. Now they're not just tired. They're emotional in ways they can't control. They're angry without clear targets. They're crying in their car over things that happened 15 years ago. They're having reactions that seem disproportionate to current events because the reactions aren't about current events. They're about everything that was held underwater finally being allowed to surface. This is the phase that makes people think they're breaking down. But Jung would have called it breaking open. The energy that was being used to suppress all that shadow material is being released, and the material is coming with it. It's chaotic and painful, and it looks like regression. But it's actually the first honest thing that's happened in the person's psyche in years. The exhaustion shifts during this phase. It's no longer the dead, flat, nothing-left exhaustion of maintaining a false life. It becomes the raw, tender exhaustion of someone who's finally feeling things they've been numb to for decades. And while this hurts, it's a different kind of hurt. It's the hurt of circulation returning to a limb that's been compressed. It's painful because something is coming back to life. People in this phase need to resist the enormous temptation to make it stop, to find new ways to numb, to rebuild the persona, to go back to performing. The pressure from the outside world will be immense. People who benefited from your persona want it back. Family systems that relied on you absorbing everyone's emotions need you to resume that function. Employers who profited from your compliance want the old you back. And some part of you wants it back too, because at least the old exhaustion was familiar. But Jung found that people who pushed through this phase, who let the shadow surface and the persona loosen and the grief move, discovered something remarkable on the other side. Energy began returning, not a little, dramatically, because all the resources that had been locked up in repression and performance were suddenly available again. Think about what becomes possible when you're no longer spending 80% of your energy maintaining a false self, when you're no longer holding your shadow underwater, when you're no longer processing everyone else's emotions as if they were your own. That energy doesn't just disappear. It was always yours. It was just allocated to things that were killing you instead of things that would feed you. Jung described people who came through this process as having a quality he called vitality that had nothing to do with being busy or productive. They were alive in a way that was palpable. Their eyes were different. Their presence had weight. Not the weight of exhaustion, but the weight of someone who's actually inhabiting their own life instead of performing a simulation of one. And this vitality didn't come from adding anything. It came entirely from subtraction, from stopping the performance, from letting the shadow integrate instead of fighting it, from putting down the emotional weight that belonged to other people, from allowing the authentic self to take up space that the persona had been occupying. This is what's so counterintuitive about Jung's approach to the everything is draining experience. The solution isn't doing more. It isn't trying harder. It isn't finding better coping strategies for a life that's fundamentally misaligned with who you are. The solution is letting the misaligned life come apart so something real can emerge from the wreckage. And that's terrifying. Because you've been taught that the performance is the point, that the persona is who you are, that keeping everyone comfortable is your job. Letting all of that dissolve feels like annihilation, but Jung would tell you that what's being annihilated isn't you. It's everything that was never you. The roles you took on to survive, the identity you constructed to be acceptable, the emotional labor you performed to keep systems functioning that should never have been your responsibility. All of that is what's draining you. And all of that is what has to go. Now, this raises the question that everyone going through this process eventually faces. If I stop performing, if I let the persona crack, if I put down everyone else's emotional weight, what's left? What if there's nothing underneath? What if the performance is all there is? Jung addressed this fear directly, and his answer was the opposite of what you'd expect. He said the reason this fear feels so real is precisely because you've been disconnected from your authentic self for so long. You've spent years, maybe your whole life, identified with the persona. So when the persona starts dissolving, it genuinely feels like you're dissolving, because you don't yet have a lived experience of who you are without the mask. The fear of emptiness isn't evidence that you're empty. It's evidence that you haven't met yourself yet. Jung called the authentic self the process of individuation, becoming who you were before the world told you who to be. And he found that this self doesn't emerge fully formed the moment the persona cracks. It emerges slowly, tentatively, like someone stepping out of a room they've been locked in for decades. First, you notice small things, a preference you forgot you had, an opinion that feels genuinely yours instead of borrowed from someone else's expectations, an emotion that arises without being immediately suppressed, a moment where you respond honestly instead of strategically. These small moments are the first signs of energy returning, not the exhausted energy of maintenance, but the alive energy of authenticity. And Jung found that this energy is qualitatively different from anything the persona could generate. The persona's energy is manufactured, forced, dependent on external validation to sustain itself. The energy of the authentic self is self-generating. It comes from alignment, from the simple, profound experience of living in accordance with who you actually are instead of who you were trained to pretend to be. But Jung was honest about what this transition costs. Because when you start living from the authentic self instead of the persona, not everyone will welcome the change. The people who loved your persona, who benefited from your compliance, who relied on you carrying their emotional weight, they will experience your transformation as loss. Some will try to pull you back. Some will accuse you of being selfish, cold, different. Some will leave. And this is where the drain shifts from internal to relational. You're no longer exhausted by your own inauthenticity. You're grieving the relationships that can't survive your realness. Jung didn't sugarcoat this. He acknowledged that individuation is often a lonely process, that becoming who you actually are means outgrowing environments and relationships that were built around who you pretended to be, that the cost of energy and aliveness is the loss of certain connections that depended on your performance. And he was clear that this loss is real and painful and shouldn't be minimized. But he also found that the people who came through this transition didn't end up alone. They ended up differently connected. Instead of maintaining dozens of relationships built on performance, they developed fewer, deeper connections built on truth. Relationships where they didn't have to manage the other person's emotions, where they could be honest without strategizing, where they could show up as themselves and be met with the same authenticity. These relationships didn't drain them. They actually generated energy, because authenticity meeting authenticity is one of the only things in human experience that creates more energy than it consumes. This is the distinction Jung kept returning to. There are ways of living that drain you and ways that feed you, and the difference has almost nothing to do with the activities themselves. A job that aligns with your actual values and uses your genuine abilities can be demanding without being draining. A relationship with someone who sees and accepts the real you can be challenging without being exhausting. Even solitude, which most people fear, becomes nourishing when you're spending it with a self you actually want to inhabit. The drain was never about doing too much. It was about doing too much of the wrong things for the wrong reasons while being someone you're not. That's the formula for the specific kind of bone-deep exhaustion you're experiencing. And Jung's formula for reversing it is equally specific. Stop maintaining the false self. Let the shadow surface and integrate. Put down emotional weight that belongs to other people, and begin the slow, frightening, ultimately liberating process of discovering who you actually are underneath decades of performance. This won't happen overnight. Jung was adamant about that. Individuation isn't a weekend workshop. It's not a revelation that fixes everything. It's a gradual, ongoing process of becoming more honest with yourself about what's real and what's performed, about which emotions are yours and which you absorbed from someone else, about what you actually want versus what you were taught to want, about who you genuinely are versus who you learned to be. But the energy begins returning almost immediately once you start, not because the process is easy, but because every small act of authenticity frees up a little more of the energy that was locked in performance. Every shadow quality you acknowledge instead of suppress releases a little more of the resources that were spent keeping it hidden. Every moment you choose honesty over accommodation restores a little more of the vitality that was being consumed by the false life. Jung would look at where you are right now, exhausted by everything, drained by interactions that shouldn't be that hard, weighed down by a heaviness that sleep can't touch, and he wouldn't see a broken person. He'd see someone whose psyche has finally decided that the cost of inauthenticity exceeds the cost of transformation. The exhaustion isn't a malfunction, it's a message. Your deepest self is withdrawing energy from the lie because it's ready to invest that energy in the truth. And yes, that truth is harder to live than the lie. At least at first. The lie had scripts and predictability and external approval. The truth has uncertainty and vulnerability and the terrifying freedom of actually choosing your own life instead of living one that was assigned to you. But the truth has something the lie could never provide: energy, real energy, the kind that comes from being so thoroughly yourself that nothing needs to be maintained, defended, or performed. That's what's waiting on the other side of this exhaustion. Not a better version of the life you've been forcing, something else entirely. A life that doesn't drain you because it's actually yours. Jung spent his career watching people make this crossing, from performed life to real life, from exhaustion to vitality, from the heavy, suffocating weight of inauthenticity to the strange lightness of finally putting down what was never theirs to carry. Not everyone makes it. Some people rebuild the persona and go back to performing. Some people find new ways to numb. Some people choose the familiar exhaustion over the unfamiliar aliveness, because at least the exhaustion is predictable. But some people don't go back. Some people let the mask crack all the way. Let the shadow surface. Let the grief move. Let the relationships that can't handle their authenticity fall away. And those people discover something that Jung said was the entire point of human psychological development. They discover that they were never actually drained by life. They were drained by the distance between the life they were living and the life that was trying to live through them. And when that distance closes, when who you are and how you live come into alignment, the exhaustion lifts. Not because circumstances changed, but because you finally stopped spending every ounce of energy you had pretending to be someone you're not. That's what this exhaustion is asking of you. Not better coping, not more rest, not a different strategy for maintaining the same performance. It's asking you to stop, to let the weight settle long enough to feel which parts of it are actually yours and which parts you've been carrying for other people, for old expectations, for a version of yourself that was never real to begin with. And then, it's asking you to do the most frightening, most freeing thing a person can do. Put down what isn't yours, and see what you have energy for when you're only carrying what belongs to you. And if this is the moment where something in you recognizes that the weight needs to come off, that the work of meeting yourself honestly is ready to begin, our guide, True Self-Discovery, was made for exactly this crossroads. 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's own teachings, designed not to give you another performance to maintain, but to help you find what's real underneath everything you've been carrying. Click below to begin.